You're listening to the Climate Dispatch podcast, presented by Sierra Club California and Angeles Chapter and Stranded Astronaut Productions. Available everywhere you listen to podcasts, we cover the stories of the climate crisis, from celebrating the wins to breaking down our fears, all while sharing collective hopes for the future. I'm Taya Jeanette, and today we're diving into the role of affordable housing in creating efficient, sustainable, and thoughtfully designed cities. Today, everything feels expensive. Groceries, electricity bills, healthcare, and especially housing. Affordability is on the mind for most Americans. California, in particular, has the highest cost of living in the nation, and a lack of affordable and adequate housing is only pushing this issue further. Where I grew up, in Santa Clara County, home prices now average at $1.7 million, and the median rent is $3,200 a month. I'm a renter, and I've been a renter for many years now. As someone born and raised in California, I've grown up exceedingly aware of the cost of living for renters and the pretty extreme barrier to entry for prospective homeowners here. I've also swapped my fair share of horror stories with friends about apartments in disrepair, leaking every time it so much as drizzles, unregulated mold spores, and being priced out of neighborhoods that they grew up in. California cities have started to implement more rigorous rent control, but this doesn't apply to every city or even every residential building across the state. Affordable housing issues also don't stop at rent control, although these policies can be helpful. Everyone deserves not just affordable housing, but dignified housing that is safe, well-maintained, and with enough space for those living in it. In other words, everyone deserves a home. How we build housing and where we build it has greater implications that are deeply intertwined with the environment, and the climate crisis is exacerbating this connection through vulnerabilities to climate disasters, building efficiency and emissions, and the greater connective tissue of social justice in a warming world. So what does it mean to create affordable housing in one of the most expensive states in the US? And how can we address the housing crisis and the climate crisis? Maybe it starts with understanding the nature of cities.
We forget that actually all of where we live and how we live is a result of how we have used nature. Even in cities, we are not distant from nature.
I sat down with Dr. Stephanie Pincel, professor at the UCLA Institute of Environment and Sustainability, to talk about the relationship between housing and the environment and the nature of cities.
Everything around us is nature. It comes from nature. The sheetrock that is on my wall behind me didn't just appear. The gypsum was mined, it was processed, it was transformed by using fossil energy, no doubt, into the sheetrock that is now on my wall. The books come from paper that came from trees, probably not papyrus these days, or silk or anything else.
In one of your articles you wrote, "Cities are the vortex of the consumption of nature." How do you frame the relationship between humans and nature, especially within a culture of ever-increasing urbanization?
Under high energy modernism that we are living in now, in a kind of capitalist system, nature is seen as an exploitable resource, that we can use nature in ways that meet our needs, so-called needs, or created needs, and that we can instrumentalize it in order to do so. Nature is there for us to pick and choose from, to plant as we wish for our instrumental needs. And so there is this kind of distancing and gap in our understanding that nature, first of all, nature doesn't always comply the way you want it to go. And also that nature is not something. We are deeply involved in nature, dependent on nature, and the instrumentalizing of it rather than the recognition of our interdependence creates these kinds of ideas about how we can infinitely manipulate it and actually fight it for our own ends.
So, when we tend to see humans and nature as two separate entities or divorce the reality that a lot of our very urban environments are made from nature, how do we remedy this and start to think of human materials and humans as part of a natural ecosystem?
One of the first things that would seem to me is to begin to have much more understanding of that process, of the material flows process. When you think of those European cities that everybody likes to talk about and say, oh, those are such walkable cities. And yes, they are, because they didn't have fossil energy when they were made. And so naturally, or forcibly, or whatever the term might be, they are cities that are built by humans with limited energy inputs to the construction of those cities. So yes, they're walkable because you couldn't spread out all over the place because you didn't have fossil energy that enabled you to do so. So fossil energy is a very significant aspect of this alienation that we can live from nature, thinking of it as separate and distinct and manipulable and manageable.
In rethinking these processes of material flows within cities, an academic framework was born. The idea of seeing cities as a living organism called urban metabolism.
Urban metabolism came about in the early to mid-60s, where a geographer was really interested in understanding water use in cities and the kind of water use per capita of cities as part of beginning to account for the resources required by urban systems. So Abel Woolman kind of borrowed from biology the idea of a metabolism and applied it to cities. It's really a very apt metaphor, that is. It's easy to understand that cities require resources, we use them, we metabolize them, and then we create waste flows. The cities rely on all of these resources to function. And if you add a social justice component on that, you can begin to think about the distribution of the consumption of the resources and the manufacture of waste. These cities are enormously resource intensive. And is it possible to make them less resource intensive? What would that look like?
When we look at what an ecosystem means, it's really, a functioning unit where there's living and non-living organisms and attributes that are interacting with each other. And that is what we see in cities. And thinking about them as biomes kind of opens up this whole world to understand all of the inputs and interactions that we see. So what are some of those flows? How would you kind of define what a city as an ecosystem really looks like, and what goes in and what goes out and what interacts?
I'm concerned that the urban ecologists limit their understanding of urban ecosystems to the vegetation, the fauna and the flora. And they forget that just as in remote places, say, those ecosystems depend on the place. It's been very hard for urban ecologists to make that connection back to the built environment. So we have this idea that planting trees in cities will mitigate the urban heat island, that they have all these benefits. You plant a tree, you're an ecologist for life or an environmentalist for life. But the fact of the matter is, they're living beings that are being planted largely in a foreign environment, even if you're using native species. The soils have been changed, the hydrology has been changed, the planting area has been constricted, they're subjected to air pollution, concrete, they're assaulted as living beings all the time, right? And yet we expect them to perform for us just as they would in, some riparian corridor. We have to bring the two together in a much more integrated way and understand that that built environment is an ecosystem
Stephanie mentions the urban heat island effect, a phenomenon where urban areas are significantly warmer than rural areas due to lack of vegetation and dense infrastructure trapping heat. You've probably noticed this effect before if you've ever turned off a major city street with mostly commercial buildings and not much shade onto a tree-lined neighborhood street with homes on each side. The breeze starts to come through, the sun is off your face, and you feel cooler. This urban tree canopy is often cited as a potential solution for cooling cities, but it also exposes the injustices within them. That street you turn down might be filled with million-dollar homes, and is likely zoned only for single-family houses. Low-income areas, often where apartments are allowed by zoning laws, have less trees and shade afforded to them. But just choosing to plant more trees isn't a complete solution without taking into account the history of injustice that has allowed this shade divide.
And in many of the places that are the most starved for shade and the hottest, they're the poorer parts of town. And those poor parts of towns have very, very small planting strips, right? Structural racism has shoved a lot of people into high-density areas with this kind of inadequate urban infrastructure to support the trees. I also think that if we're really serious about urban heat, we have to start improving the thermal capacity of the buildings. We should be painting a lot of roofs white. We should not allow dark roofs, period. Why do we still allow people to have black asphalt roofs if we're worried about urban heat?
As much as we love trees.
I've probably planted more trees than most people. And I think trees are great, but there's this kind of weird obsession with the tree. The tree, the tree, the tree, the tree. So urban greening in a place where we didn't have very many trees to begin with is very peculiar and extremely interesting in terms of the ideology that has arisen around nature services.
Wired has always put a microscope on the people, power, and forces shaping our world. Uncanny Valley brings that same fearless reporting straight to your feed. Is Doge finally over? Will AI actually democratize American healthcare? Each week, Wired journalists from across the newsroom are going to unpack where politics, technology, and Silicon Valley collide. From conversations with tech leaders across Silicon Valley, internet fandom investigations, and government crackdowns on rigged gambling, we're taking you all over the news cycle, going straight inside the priorities, pressures, and power plays driving today's biggest decisions. Uncanny Valley tackles the questions keeping you up at night and helps make sense of the future taking shape right now. Listen to new episodes every Thursday, wherever you get your podcasts.
The obvious elephant in the room as we talk about urbanization, especially in California, is our very apparent and visible housing crisis that is present here. From your research in looking into the built environment and urban ecology, what do you see as some of the leading drivers of the housing crisis in California?
Profit. Housing, it's like many things in the current period where we have a capitalist system that we expect to provide basic services. Housing, healthcare, some education, and so forth. And there is a profound disconnect between providing those services at an affordable rate for most people and making profit.
Profit plays an undeniable role across the intersections of housing, climate, and health. As long as there is a profit to be made from fossil fuels, they will continue to be produced and sold despite risks to human and planetary health. As long as human services, like housing and utilities, are privatized, there will be little incentive for companies to provide affordable versions of these basic necessities without government interference. But the issue also lies in what and where we build, and the systems in place to control that process.
We are not thinking of creating livable cities. We're thinking of housing people. We are afraid to touch the single family zone and create the conditions under which, as they say, a gentle density can be built. So we have high density fortresses around unaffordable single family dwellings that only white wealthy people can live in. So it's a conundrum, because what gives here? Where are we going to get the equity capital in a private market to build more housing at rates of return that equity capital will accept? It's a very difficult situation. We don't have a lot of good examples except what was built before zoning came in. And those are the very mixed-use, denser areas that are now the target for increased density. And they will destroy that urban fabric that was walkable, that was intermixed, and that made those places so attractive.
What Dr. Pincel is saying here is that our cities are zoned for different uses across them. Some areas are zoned for mixed use, meaning commercial buildings coexist with residential units, like apartments or condos. Then there's medium to low density zoning that allows for multifamily housing, some apartments, mixed with townhomes, duplexes, ADUs, and also single family homes. Single family zoning is the most restrictive. These are designed specifically for picturesque homes, often with a yard and ample space between each unit. Using Los Angeles as an example, more than 70% of residential land is zoned for single-family homes, therefore completely shutting out the ability to build more affordable units within an area, and forcing more density into one place. The already high-density areas like Koreatown in Los Angeles, the Tenderloin in San Francisco, or Midtown in Sacramento are the ones being targeted for even more development, which means that what little green space and bike pathways they might have will be sacrificed to make more room, while single-family home zones continue to enjoy all the benefits of lower density spaces. Part of understanding why certain rules and restrictions like these exist is looking at the decision process behind how we build urban cities. Stephanie tells me that when we design cities, specifically newer cities like Los Angeles, is also critical to shaping how they're built.
The ability to exert fossil energy means that you don't have to design in place. What our ability to surmount nature has done with fossil energy is obliterate any connection to place. You have the same builders, you have the same housing types, and you have the same physical disposition of the built environment on the landscape. So in Southern California, for example, we have had, until disruptions, but still today, cooling breezes at night. Just about everywhere in the LA basin, you have a cooling effect at night. But we don't build buildings to take advantage of that cooling effect because we haven't oriented the windows in the direction of the cooling breezes. We don't build thermally performing buildings that will, if you open all your windows at night and the cool air cools the environment, in the morning you shut all your windows, you close all your shades and so on, and maintain that coolness until the next evening. We don't build buildings like that because for the wealthy, at least, or the more affluent, you can put in air conditioning. And so what we have is this doubling down on technological additives to compensate for poorly built buildings, inadapted buildings to place. The building materials don't come from the region, and we don't consider things like the sun's movement in the sky or the cooling breezes. We don't orient buildings well. We don't create southern-facing shade structures that create cooled environments in the summertime, which means that we have built an environment that is overly dependent on the ability to apply fossil energy, heating and cooling to make those places livable, that the buildings are crap. And that's extremely serious.
Commercial and residential buildings make up over a third of total greenhouse gas emissions globally. Due to a reliance on fossil fuels for energy and also leakage from inefficient building construction, the built environment is directly contributing to the climate crisis. But housing and climate change aren't just related by the amount of greenhouse gas emissions from residential buildings. They're also uniquely linked to the level of protection or vulnerability for communities, and this can exacerbate existing housing injustices. Choosing to build on a floodplain or in a high-risk fire zone could mean potentially losing your home, with roughly 1 in 10 U.S. houses impacted by natural disasters in 2021. Heat waves, which are becoming more frequent and intense due to the climate crisis, are far more likely to harm low-income communities who don't have access to AC units, or the unhoused populations that are far more exposed to extreme weather and other hazards like air pollution. Affluent areas, on the other hand, have built-in air conditioning and heating. The overpresence of fossil energy, as Stephanie mentions, has allowed us to build without ever considering the environment around us. When we're looking at cities and the kind of school of thought that cities are sustainable, do you believe that cities are sustainable, that is the best path forward versus more rural living or maybe a middle?
A city depends on inputs. There's just no way around that. And clearly there are ways in which, as we've talked about, cities could reduce their inputs, right? Better buildings, more public transportation, a lot of the things that we've talked about for a very, very long time. Our economy in the United States runs on consumption. It does not run on production. We need to deconcentrate the cities and have a more robust small town infrastructure that is surrounded by local agriculture and close some of these loops, right? So that we're not eating cherries in January that are grown in Chile. I say that because my husband loves cherries. So he went to the grocery store and there were cherries. It was like, really? You're buying cherries? But just as a window into how completely globalized a lot of this stuff is and how the impacts of that are enormous. So if we could return to a kind of understanding of seasonality, then it means we have to descale these cities because we don't have the inputs that are required to maintain them at the scale that they exist. And we have an opportunity to really think about repopulating a lot of these small towns and revitalizing those economies and ways of life that bring you more time and more connection to place.
Cities are trying to become more sustainable. Los Angeles broke up with coal power last year and is moving towards the goal of running completely on clean energy by 2035. San Francisco made the transition to 100% renewable energy in 2023 using solar, wind, and geothermal energy. But this is an optional service provided by Clean Power SF that comes with an extra, if nominal, fee to the consumer. As we've made clear in this episode, emissions aren't the only factor in the relationship between housing and the environment. So, what will it take to create affordable housing that exists in harmony with nature and works within sustainable systems, even if it's not the most profitable option?
For the situation in California and for local governments, what we need is profound tax reform so that the extreme wealth of the state, I mean, we keep on saying we're the 5th largest economy or the 6th largest economy or something like that in the world, and yet we're tax starved, which makes absolutely no sense. So we need to be able to liberate tax money to create a more equitable tax structure so that we have public money to invest in these changes that we feel are important, whether it's very low interest loans to small scale local builders, whether it's very low interest loans to single family proprietors who then build a little duplex in the back. I don't know for sure, but without money you can't do very much. It really is a system that has robbed the middle class and the working class of the United States in favor of the rich. The rich are richer than they ever have been. There's a lot of money out there. Don't tell me there's no money. There is money. We simply don't have the system to access the money. So I think that one of the tropes that we have is that there are solutions, right? There is a solution. There are many small strategies that can ameliorate a problem. So how do you overcome structural racism with an immediate solution? Not too easy, right? So how can we begin to think about a more nuanced approach?
Stephanie tells me we need more visionary approaches to the dual crises of housing and climate. We need to think past just housing people to how we can build equitable, sustainable, and livable cities. In a dimly lit Thai restaurant and sometimes karaoke bar in Los Angeles' Koreatown, environmentalists, housing advocates, and mobility enthusiasts gathered to share their visions of a sustainable urban environment. I joined the event to hear exactly what they had to say.
My name is Awe. I am with Urban Environmentalist LA. And thank you all for coming out to our first Lightning Talks event here at Thai Angel. I'll pass it over to our first talk.
I want to point out that the greenest home in LA is not necessarily what people think. If you are in a place like we are right now in Koreatown, you can take the metro rail, you can walk, you can bike to your daily destinations. Whereas if you are, let's say in the Hollywood Hills, you really need to drive a private vehicle to get to most locations. You know, at times, housing advocates and environmental advocates have been at odds with one another, but we really see that there is a chance to work together. We can advocate for walkable density together, making it easier to build.
You know, I think other people around the country would be surprised if we said that LA was running out of space. We have advertised ourselves for so long as the city of dreams. My dream is that as we start to add density and make our transition from suburban to urban, that we need to take the opportunity to incorporate real in-ground and ground-level nature open space, natural open space, in our policy, planning, designs, and construction.
My name is Marcella Riddick, born and raised in LA, and I spend about 3/4 of the year here in downtown LA in my 700-foot studio. But when I moved to Fort Collins, Colorado for school, I saw what it could look like when a place is built for both sustainability and outdoor culture. Bikeable streets, LEED sustainable green buildings, easy access to nature. But what stuck with me was that my fellow Black classmates, that made up about 2% of our giant campus, couldn't access that. They lived further away and had to drive into campus, and they were working weekends instead of going out into the mountains and skiing. So I started asking, we're talking about sustainable cities and towns, but who is it sustainable for?
Knowing a space is more than understanding that it was 90 degrees outside today. If you lack the knowledge of the other things that exist in your home, then how can you make enough space for them? For example, the trees that are overgrown in the tiny plots of space that they're given and ruin our sidewalks, right? Community building starts with space. The way to move forward in developing housing is also developing our relationship to our home.
To meet our state-mandated housing goals, Los Angeles needs to permit around 57,000 units of housing every year. Currently, we are producing around 17,000. The solutions are proven, the reforms are ready. What's needed now is the political will to extend it to all types of housing and everyone that needs a home. Thank you.
Thank you to Chris Rhee, Gary Lai, Nassim Janahard Mahboob, Marcella Riddick, and Deacon Shaw, respectively, for sharing their thoughts on building sustainable and affordable urban spaces. We have the solutions for today, but we need the visions for tomorrow. It's expected that 68% of people will live in cities by 2050. We need to imagine what it looks like to create cities that focus on sustainable, equitable, and dignified housing. Cities that see nature as a neighbor, not a conquest or a pest, and that understand all the inputs, interactions, and living flows happening all around, simultaneously within them. And on that note, here's Language and Violence by Lacey Guthrie.
Hi, it's Megan from the Sierra Club Angeles chapter. If this episode moved you, I'm here to invite you to turn that energy into action. Support our environmental and social justice work today with a donation at sierraclub.org/California. Every win for climate and justice starts with a community. Join ours at sierraclub.org/California.
The Climate Dispatch is a podcast by Stranded Astronaut Productions and Sierra Club California and Angeles chapter. Produced by myself, Tay Jeanette, and Megan Spatz. Audio engineering and editing by Maxfield Biggs, and original theme music and score by Phil Hamilton.